In this video, we're going to be looking at tax incidence, which is really just a shorthand way of saying the neoclassical analysis of who bears the burden of a tax imposed on the market. That is, do demanders or suppliers bear the larger burden of that tax? So let's start out by looking at how a tax impacts a market. And we'll take just for now the example of a tax imposed on the suppliers of a particular good in a particular market. So suppose the government comes in and says that for every unit the suppliers of whatever this particular good might be sells, those suppliers are going to need to pay a tax of some unit. Let's just call it small t, whatever that tax might be. The effect on the market is going to be a decrease in supply, which will be a leftward shift in the supply curve. But for our purposes here, we can actually think of that also as an upward movement of the supply curve by exactly the amount of the tax, so that the new supply curve is going to be vertically above the original supply curve by the amount of the tax, lowercase t there. Now, before we move on, let's look at these blue and red shadings. As we've seen previously, the blue triangle here represents the consumer surplus that was being enjoyed by consumers prior to this tax at a price of P sub 0, and the red then represents the producer surplus prior to the tax at a price of P0. So, of course, the first thing we're going to see is that this tax, which decreases supply, causing this leftward or upward shift in the supply curve, is going to cause an increase in the price to P sub 1. And note, I've marked also P sub 1 minus T. This is going to be the price, that is the new market price, minus the amount of the tax. That'll be relevant here in just a moment. So let's look at the impact then in terms of consumer and producer surplus from this tax, which decreases supply and causes a higher price. Of course, at a higher price, consumer surplus is going to shrink. Consumer surplus is always going to be the area between the demand curve and the price that demanders are paying. And in this case, that's the area between the demand curve here and the new price of P sub 1. Producer surplus is going to be similar, but it's going to be a little bit more complex. Producer surplus is always going to be the area above the supply curve, and we're going to look at the original supply curve for these purposes, and below the price that producers are actually taking home. And in this case, even though the market price is P sub 1, the price that producers are actually taking home is that price P sub 1 minus the tax, because of course producers have to pay that tax, so it comes out of their revenues. That's why we get a producer surplus area here, again below the price minus the tax and above the supply curve. So you'll notice that both producer and consumer surplus have decreased as a result of this tax. We can also then go further and look at the actual tax revenue collected. The tax revenue collected is going to be the tax rate, that lowercase t, times the quantity being taxed. Now, of course, as a result of this decrease in supply and increase in price, you're also going to see a decrease in the quantity in this market from Q sub 0 to Q sub 1. So the amount being taxed is going to be Q sub 1, which means that the area of this rectangle here, with a base of that quantity Q sub 1 and a height of the tax, that area is going to represent the tax revenue to the government. You notice then that there's one leftover component that used to be consumer and producer surplus that we haven't accounted for. And of course, as we've seen in previous videos, that's going to be the dead weight loss. This tax is going to cause a decrease in the amount of this good or service being produced, and as a result, the consumer and producer surplus that would have been generated at a quantity of Q sub 0 doesn't get generated, and we call that again dead weight loss. So this is the basic analysis of how a tax impacts the market. It will decrease both consumer and producer surplus, but some of that consumer and producer surplus will become tax revenue, so it's not like it goes away, it just gets transferred to the government, but some of the impact is also going to be in the form of dead weight loss, and that's consumer and producer surplus that nobody gets simply because the government has imposed this tax on the market, moving us away from the optimal quantity of Q sub 0. So before we move on, just to be sure, when we impose this tax on suppliers in this case, and we'll come back later to imposing a tax on demanders as well, and then go on to calculate consumer and producer surplus, as well as dead weight loss and so on, we'll always be wanting to make the new calculations for consumer and producer surplus based on the original supply and demand curves. In this case, the demand curve didn't change, but you'll notice that we calculated producer surplus based on the original supply curve, so that producer surplus was above that original supply curve, S sub 0, and below the price minus the tax. So we make reference then to the original supply curve because the new supply curve isn't actually telling us the actual costs to society. Recall that the supply curve tells us the marginal social costs of producing this good. In this case, the new supply curve tells us both those marginal social costs and the tax. So to be sure that we don't double count, we refer to the original supply curve to calculate producer surplus and so on. So those are the basics of how a tax impacts the market. And I want to get back to this question then of how the burden of taxation is distributed between consumers and producers. We've seen already that if you impose a tax on suppliers, it's not just suppliers who pay that tax in terms of lost surplus. We saw that both consumer surplus and producer surplus shrink. And there's an intuitive reason for why this would be, of course. When you impose a tax on suppliers, that decreases supply and that increases prices. And it's through that price increase that some of that tax burden is actually being transferred on to consumers. And we see this in our model through the shrinkage of consumer surplus. What this analysis can tell us is that, in fact, the tax burden in terms of who pays how much of that tax, how much of the tax comes out of consumer surplus versus producer surplus, is actually completely independent of who actually pays the tax in terms of which side, supply or demand, that the government imposes this tax on. And I can demonstrate this graphically here. On the left and right, you've got two identical supply and demand models. Same supply curves, same demand curves. On the left, I'm going to tax suppliers, which is going to cause a decrease, a leftward shift in supply, or you can think of that as an increase vertically of the supply curve by the amount of the tax over the original supply curve. On the right, again, we've got the same supply and demand curves. I'm going to impose in that graph a tax by the same amount as on the graph on the left, but on demanders instead of suppliers. This is going to cause a decrease or a leftward shift in the demand curve, but we can think of that also as a vertical downward shift by the amount of the tax in the demand curve as well. Now, before we show these taxes, I just want to note that in both markets, P sub 0 is the equilibrium optimal price that's going to maximize consumer and producer surplus taken together. Consumer surplus is going to be the area for both graphs above that price up to the demand curve. Producer surplus is going to be the area above the supply curve up to that price. Again, that'll be the case in both graphs here. So in the graph on the left, again, we impose a tax on the suppliers that shifts the supply curve vertically up by the amount of the tax. We end up, as we just saw, with a higher price of P sub 1. Consumer surplus and producer surplus will shrink as a result. In the graph on the right, I'm going to impose the exact same tax, but I'm going to impose it on demanders, which is going to shift the demand curve down by the amount of the tax. This is going to cause a lower price at P sub 1. Again, P sub 1 plus the tax then is also going to be relevant in this graph. And what we see then is if everything above P sub 0 was consumer surplus and everything below P sub 0 was producer surplus, then we can see that the tax components, this middle rectangle here, really these two rectangles, is going to be identical in both cases. Here on the left and on the right, we see that that is the same set of rectangles representing the tax revenue, and we can also see that the proportion of the tax revenue that comes out of consumer and producer surplus are also the same. In this case, regardless of whether we taxed suppliers or demanders, the suppliers, producers, paid the bulk of that tax in terms of that tax coming principally out of producer surplus, shaded here in red on both graphs, as opposed to coming out of consumer surplus, shaded in blue on both graphs. So what we've seen here then graphically is that the burden of taxation doesn't actually matter in terms of who actually pays the tax. The person who physically pays the tax that the government actually imposes the tax on is not going to be the person, the group, demanders versus suppliers, who actually bears the greatest burden of the tax, at least not necessarily, in terms of their surplus that's lost. What's relevant then is actually the relative inelasticity of one's demand or supply curve, and that is going to impact who pays the larger share of the tax burden. So just to review, relative elasticities is essentially the same concept that we've looked at in terms of elasticity before, but we're now going to be talking about the entire curve rather than a point or a range on the curve. Relative elasticities is going to tell us whether price or quantity will change more when a curve shifts. So you can think of this in simplest terms of the steeper curve, demand or supply, is going to be the curve that is more inelastic or less elastic, versus the flatter curve, demand or supply, being the more elastic or less inelastic of the two curves. If, for instance, demand is relatively inelastic, which of course implies that supply is relatively elastic, then a shift in supply will lead to a greater change in price than in quantity. Demand's responsiveness, in a sense, its elasticity, is relatively weak, which is what we've just said. Demand is relatively inelastic. Let me show you what this looks like graphically. Suppose I've got a supply curve that looks like this, and I've got a demand curve that is relatively steep. We would say then demand is relatively inelastic, but we could also say that supply is relatively elastic. What we're going to do then is increase the supply curve. That's going to be a rightward shift in supply, and we know that as a result, the price is going to go down and the quantity is going to go up in equilibrium in the market. The question is, which changes more, price or quantity? And what we're seeing here is that because demand is relatively inelastic, most of this change occurs through the lower price relative to the greater quantity. You could even go as far as to think of what would happen if demand were perfectly inelastic, a vertical demand curve. And in that case, of course, an increase in supply is going to translate only into a lower price with no change in quantity. We could take the same supply curve and we're going to increase supply by the same amounts, but we'll change one thing. We'll say demand is relatively elastic. We'll draw a relatively flat demand curve. Again, we increase supply then, and what we see is the price goes down, but only by a little. Most of the change happens in terms of the quantity response, which makes sense because demand here is relatively elastic. So its quantity responsiveness, which is fundamentally what we mean by elastic, is relatively great, again, relative to that price change. We can imagine a scenario in which demand is perfectly or infinitely elastic, which would be a demand curve that is horizontal, and in that case, supply increasing would translate only into a quantity increase with no price change at all. So what we're saying then is that a tax will always decrease the curve being taxed, which for demand looks like a downward shift by the amount of the tax, and for supply looks like an upward shift by the amount of the tax. And some of the tax burden is always going to be shifted onto the other side of the market. If you impose a tax on suppliers, some of that tax burden is going to be shifted onto consumers in terms of lost consumer surplus through the higher price, and vice versa. Essentially, if you impose a tax on demanders, some of that tax burden is going to be shifted onto suppliers by virtue of the lower price that results. So if the question is, who bears the larger burden and what causes them to bear that larger burden? The answer is to look to the relative elasticities of demand versus supply. What we'll see is the more relatively inelastic demand is or supply is, the larger the tax burden that that group, demanders or suppliers, is going to bear. If demand is more inelastic, if the demand curve is steeper than supply, then consumers are going to pay the greater share. That is, most of that tax is going to come out of consumer surplus. And likewise, if supply is more inelastic, if the supply curve is steeper than the demand curve, then producers are going to pay the greater share of the tax burden in terms of that tax burden coming mostly out of producer surplus. And again, we can see this graphically. Here I've drawn the same two supply curves on both of these graphs, but I've drawn two different demand curves. In the graph on the left, we've got a relatively elastic demand curve. The demand curve is relatively flat. In the graph on the right, demand is relatively inelastic. It's a relatively steep demand curve, again, relative to the supply curve. If we went on then to impose the same tax of lowercase t on both markets, and we impose it in both cases on suppliers, what we find out is we'll now get different distributions of this tax burden. In the graph on the left, we see that most of that tax burden came out of producer surplus relative to the small amounts that came out of consumer surplus. In the graph on the right, we see that that same tax, which shifts the supply curve vertically upwards by the amount of the tax, leads to a distribution of the tax in which consumers actually pay the bulk of that tax. And again, the intuition here should be fairly clear. We already know that when we impose a tax on either suppliers or demanders, some of that tax is going to get shifted onto the other side of the markets. The question is how much will get shifted. In the case of imposing a tax on suppliers, how much of that tax can be shifted onto the demand side of the markets depends on how much the price can increase as a result of the decrease in supply. In the scenario on the left, we said demand is relatively elastic, which means demanders are relatively responsive to a price increase. And you can think of this as if prices go up because suppliers raise the price because ultimately the government imposed this tax, then demanders are relatively responsive to that. They can get out of the markets and stop buying this thing, which means suppliers aren't going to be able to raise the price by very much, which means ultimately that suppliers or producers are going to end up paying the bulk of this tax. In the scenario on the right, in contrast, we said that demand is relatively inelastic, which is to say that demanders aren't very responsive. You can raise the price quite a bit, and you're not going to see a large drop-off in the quantity that people will continue to purchase. And as a result, we see that the tax imposed on suppliers corresponds to a larger increase in the price, which allows a greater amount of that total tax burden to be transferred onto consumers. And I think this is a really interesting thing that we can do with this welfare analysis and the supply and demand model. This is a useful tool for understanding a question, that is, who bears the larger burden of a tax imposed on a market, that might not be intuitive without these tools.